We are. Hey, welcome to the Lowdown. Usual suspects. Eric is here with me, Frankie. We have Alan Deremo here this week, and today. I'm not really sure how often we do these anymore, but we're really pleased to
2020.
have. That's right. That's the way it is. It's the new normal.
That's
We're
right.
really pleased to have Alan here. Alan has a resume like 3 miles long of really, really cool artists he's played with, and he's got a lot of great stuff I'm sure we're gonna be able to talk about. But also, Alan likes to, I would say
Tinker.
tinker would be a great word. Yeah, I mean, just like we all do, kind of like kind of mess with something that might already be great, but like give that little extra, like, boy, I wish it had a little bit more of this or a little less of that, and next thing you know, boy, you get like a really super instrument, right? I mean, that's how I kind of look at it.
Yep.
Yeah, tinkering is something that I've done probably since I was 12 years old with the very first instruments that I had. The first bass being a Tysco from the late 60s,
Yeah.
which was really a piece of crap. But now they're going for, probably in the high three figures. So some people like them, but
Yeah, it's crazy, right? Yeah.
for some reason I had an inclination to paint the body black. So that was my first actual mod or attempt to alter anything on an instrument that I had. And so I bought a can of black spray paint and taped off the parts. I didn't even have the smarts to actually disassemble the bass and take the pickups out and things like that. So it was a very crude attempt. And then I ended up, I think, just trading it away for a guitar a few years later. The neck was severely bowed and it was pretty unplayable anyway.
Well, it was a Tisco, so
yeah. And then probably my second attempt at any sort of mod was on the first name brand bass I had, which was a Gibson EBO from about 1970.
Cool.
Real mud machine.
Kind of a
and I wanted to make it less of a mud machine. So I ordered a Fender Telecaster bass pickup,
cool.
removed the humbucker, and mounted the tele bass pickup in and soldered it in. And fortunately, I didn't have to do anything but angle the pickup a little bit to get the magnets to line up with the strings. Yeah. And it was a marginal improvement. I mean, it still was pretty crappy, but I actually used it that way until I ended up trading it away for a P bass a couple years later. And I've probably been basically a Fender guy ever since, although probably only half the instruments I own now are actual Fenders, but that's always kind of my orientation.
Cool. Do you find were you more of a P bass guy or a J bass guy?
I have been historically a J bass guy until about 2 years ago, and I really kind of moved into the P bass camp. I always tended to record with P basses more. For some reason, it just always was a more surefire solution for recording. But I've kind of moved squarely into P basses for live playing as well. Although on a lot of gigs, I need a 5-string just because the music calls for it. And I don't happen to own a 5-string P, but I would like to acquire one sometime soon. That's kind of the next thing on the list if I ever have any live gigs again.
Boy, oh boy, yeah,
that's a whole other subject.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you gigging at all right now?
I've had a handful of gigs since the late summer. We kind of moved out of the strict lockdown in California around the middle of the summer. So there were some outdoor gigs that came back, some of which I had already had booked that were kind of questionable whether they would be canceled or not. And I haven't really felt totally comfortable gigging because of the varying precautions that people are taking, both audience-wise and crew people and so forth. So as much as I would love to get out and play, it just in a lot of cases, it doesn't feel real safe right now to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of
Definitely messed with everybody's mojo, I think, this year. 2020 just needs to go away and be done.
Truly. Yeah. And, you know, I don't depend entirely on touring for my work, but my friends that do have really been hit hard. And, you know, right now their unemployment's about to run out, and it just could be very tenuous for some people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know a couple folks that are techs, you know, who are touring techs. You know, usually, you know, they're doing a tour and then they already have a plan for, you know, what they're jumping onto next and next. You
Yeah.
know, and it's just all kind of dried up, you know.
Yeah.
So it's just, you know, not a great time, that's for sure.
No, it isn't.
That's scary.
So talk to us a little bit about, you know, so the listeners on this podcast primarily, you know, are either bass players themselves, or they are luthiers that are building. And, you know, now is sort of like the time that everybody's doing that, you know, because they can't get out. You know,
Sure.
so we see lots of people that are just coming in and, you know, they're ordering things, you know, working in the garage or the basement, or, you know, and just sort of kind of gearing up for the winter, you know, that sort of thing. So how'd you get your start? And tell us how that all got going.
Well, my dad is a professional musician. He plays saxophone, clarinet, and flute. And his kind of heyday was in the late 50s and early 60s. He played on recordings by Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole, and played with a lot of well-known big bands of the time, like Stan Kenton, Les Brown,
That's
Ray
awesome.
McKinley. He was my inspiration to get into music. So the first instrument that I actually picked up was clarinet, but around the same time I started playing guitar and was learning just the typical garage band stuff that any kid would in that era.
Mm-hmm.
And of course the Beatles were a huge influence, you know, coming along around that time, and, you know, just causing a huge surge in interest in string instruments and bands and that sort of thing. So I was playing guitar, you know, taking lessons and kind of progressing semi-seriously. But my dad noticed that I was actually picking bass lines out on the guitar. And he said, I think I should get you a bass, which he eventually did. So maybe for my 9th birthday, I got the Teisco bass that I mentioned earlier. And even though I played clarinet, saxophone, and flute also all the way through college, the bass was kind of always the most fun thing for me to do. And eventually it kind of took over and the other instruments fell away. Although I still do play guitar quite a bit on the recording side of things. So I just kind of started playing in bands in high school, and progressed into actual working bands around the time I was maybe 18. And that, at the time, that meant club bands that played 5 to 7 nights a week. So that was really kind of being in the trenches for me, and learning the most in a real world situation. And fortunately, I had the discipline to make use of that time and really check out, you know, in the cover bands that I played in, I analyzed the records that had the songs we were learning, and kind of dug into what made them good, and, you know, what I could gain from learning all the parts in the record. And that was a big part of my musical education, as well as the formal side of things, being a music major in college, and having a background in theory and all that sort of stuff.
Indeed. That's really cool.
So that was kind of the genesis of it. And eventually I started working with maybe somewhat more well-known people in my 20s, and just kind of continued on from there.
When would you say was like the one gig or the one like person you started playing with where you kind of said, wow, this is really sort of happening for me on the like a slightly bigger kind of scale than was happening before?
Well, probably this would have been in the early 90s, and I had been playing for a while already, but I was living in LA and ended up playing with a band called Cecilia Noel and the Wild Clams, which had a bunch of gigs around LA and occasionally out of town, but kind of most steadily a regular Monday night gig at the Baked Potato in North Hollywood. And that lasted for a few years and was quite a draw just for all kinds of musicians coming through town. And it was known probably for a while as the band to see in town. So that was a great deal of exposure, being in that situation, playing with all kinds of great players, particularly drummers and percussionists. And a lot of things that I've done on higher levels actually came out of that situation in different ways. Even playing with John Denver, which I did for a few years in the mid and late 90s until he passed away. That came out of the Wild Clams because the percussionist that was working with John was in the Wild Clams. They had an opening in the bass chair with John, and he threw my name in the hat for that one. So a lot of it really does kind of come back to the idea of just being visible, you know, being out there on the scene and seen and heard by people. So I'd have to say, to answer Frankie's question, that situation with Cecilia Noel was really kind of pivotal for me as far as just getting lots of exposure and breaking into some other kinds of work.
That's really cool. Kind of, you know, obviously a band where all the players are great. They obviously have
well, just for example, with that band on the drum side, the regular drummer in the beginning was Tristan Bowden, who played with Chicago for 28 years. I had known him before I got in that band, and he was kind of my in. But some of the other drummers that played in the band when Tris was gone were Simon Phillips, Dave Weckl, Jonathan Moffat, who had played with Michael Jackson, people like that. Walfredo Reyes, just tons of amazing drummers and percussionists as well. So that was a treat for me to play the same music with a bunch of different drummers and kind of experience the differences and their feels and their approaches to time. And that was a real education.
Oh, for sure. I mean, there's nothing like playing with a great drummer. It's just great how different they all can be, which is true of all instrumentalists. But yeah, the way the time is felt, especially, can be a whole new thing with certain, you know, playing with certain drummers for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Simon Phillips. I love Simon Phillips.
Yeah, he was incredible. He's such a good listener, and he had not played much Latin music before, and that band was primarily sort of a salsa, rock, jazz, psychedelic kind of hybrid with even some hip hop elements coming in toward the end. But Simon really glommed onto the aspects of Latin music that he hadn't strangely done much before. And by the time we ended up doing a gig, he had totally nailed it.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Just decided he wanted to learn it and just do it, you know, head first, and got it right down. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
You've, I mean, I know for myself, I mean, having played with like 2 or 3, like, you know, drummers I consider to be exceptional, you know, based on the drummers I've played with, you know, not name drummers, you know, at all, but, you know, getting to play with a great drummer is like, if you have to do that even once, that's a really wonderful thing, but you've done it like a lot of times. So it's really, that's pretty damn cool, you know?
Yeah. And
enviable, you know,
just playing with a drummer that listens, not just to the bass, but to everything else that's going on. And that pairing of the bass and drums, and if you're on the same wavelength, it's a feeling that's just like nothing else for me, and I'm sure for you guys too.
Oh, for sure, it's like magic, you know. I don't know how else to describe it. It just kind of, everything feels right. It doesn't matter what you do, everything just feels right. You know, you just get this you really know what's going to happen as it, before it happens. It feels like when that's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit, if you can. There's, let's see if I can share it real quick and show you. So talk to us a little bit about the base that I have.
Okay. What you guys are looking at is kind of a parts base that is made up of a Warmoth cottonwood body and a late 90s Fender genuine replacement P-bass neck. And this was sort of my first attempt at a parts base. The body I picked up from the Warmoth booth at the NAMM show, probably 1992. And I wasn't really looking for a cottonwood body specifically, but they kind of sold me on it, saying cottonwood is similar to basswood, but more durable, similarly lightweight and resonant. And so I just kind of took a chance on it. And I actually had a Warmoth jazz neck on it initially, but it didn't really work totally until I found this P-bass neck a few years later. So it was also my first attempt at finishing, and somehow I had gotten some information about nitro finishes. At the time, there wasn't YouTube or a lot of resources for learning about finishing.
Yeah.
So some of it came from Stu Mack videos. Dan Erlewine, being a great craftsman, a great teacher, had some good pointers. And I actually used tempera paint for the color. Tempera paint is typically like an art school product, or kids use it to paint. So the actual color coat initially was Sonic Blue tempera paint, and then I sprayed nitro over it. But strangely enough, as I built up the coats of the clear nitro, it yellowed and became this kind of pukey green color that you see. So the color wasn't intentional. It was a total accident, actually. And it ended up being kind of a nebulous color in terms of not really matching any legitimate Fender color from the era, or even more modern Fender colors. But it has a look that is kind of cool. And the pickguard that you guys see on it is from Spitfire Tortoiseshell. I don't know if you know about Spitfire, but it's a guy in Central California that crafts pretty authentic looking tortoiseshell pickguards. And so that's where that came from. The pickups are Duncan Antiquity 2s. The bridge on there is actually from a 64 jazz bass, which I also own, but I have a badass bridge on the jazz bass, which would be sacrilege to a lot of people, but for some reason it did actually help a lot of things on the jazz bass. So that bridge was just sitting around and I ended up putting it on this bass. So it's a lot of happy accidents, and it happens to be my #1 recording bass. It just sounds amazing. Totally authentic, early 60s thump. And one thing that really helps that is the strings are 20 years old. They're Lakeland Joe Osborne flats that I put on probably in 99.
Wow.
And they've managed to hold their pitch and not unravel or sort of decompose in any way that makes them unusable. But that's pretty much the size of it. I actually have it right here. And it's pretty light, weighs about 8.5 pounds. The tuners are Gotos. And on most of my Fenders, I end up putting Hipshot detuners on them. Just because if I play live, it's nice to have that option to jump down to the D and E flat, as I'm sure you guys know.
Oh, yeah.
But this one, since I tend to use it mostly just for recording, I don't have a detuner on
Makes
this
sense.
one.
Yeah, you could take your time.
It's got a repro decal, which I don't know, it's kind of borderline illegal, but
We'll just call that artistic.
yeah. And there are a couple spots, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, where there's some finished chips and you can see through to the sonic blue
Yeah. Oh yeah, like right
color.
there. Yeah, that's great.
There's one chip, right?
It,
A couple in this area here.
Neat. What's cool is like it is typical for the nitro to yellow, over time, but
Yeah.
it almost like makes it look like it wants to glow in the dark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a cool color. And one other strange accidental byproduct was there's some serious finish checking. I don't know if you can see it at all, but I think it resulted from putting the clear coats on too early before the color coat had actually totally dried. So it shrunk or, checked in this really authentically crazy way. When I do take this thing out and play live, people are pretty impressed because it looks like an old bass, but it's just all of that is really accidental.
And think about that for what came about accidentally just because of your just desire and willingness to experiment. I mean, if you would have paid somebody at like the custom shop to try such a thing,
the relic, guys that specialize in relic finishes, this would be right in their wheelhouse. But it all just came out of my ignorance or innocence as a builder. And again, builder is probably overstating it. Assembler.
So talk to us about that. That's sort of fascinating to me, right? There's so many of our listeners that are on that, are sort of, they get in a point where this is their first, mod, this is their first, sort of foray into doing anything with the electronics or anything else really on the bass, because they're trying to find that sort of dial in that sound that they're looking for. And, it's a scary thing, right? I mean, the very first time you do anything, certainly if you start messing with the wood, so do you have any advice for, the listeners, like in terms of like getting over that sort of that anxiety?
Well, I would say, don't do anything irreversible until you are willing to kind of commit 100% to altering an instrument in a way that may not be, you may not be able to put it back to its original state. Something like swapping out pickups is not that invasive, particularly if you use the same screw holes, if there's nothing else that really changes the instrument. And again, it also kind of depends on the value of the instrument. And obviously with a vintage instrument, you'd be probably less likely to want to do something serious in terms of altering the instrument. If you can't put it back to its original state, if you are trying to maintain the collectible value of it and so forth. So things like altering pickups, swapping out bridges, tuners, those are all, in most cases, things that can be done without really any harm to the instrument. And I've done a lot of that, particularly with pickups and bridges, to try to improve instruments. And sometimes it's hard to determine what the effect will be.
Sure.
I've had some basses where I've gone through maybe 3 or 4 different sets of pickups, and there's not much change because there's just some inherent factors in the way the instrument is acoustically that pickups can't solve or make better. Sometimes a pickup swap can be just night and day, like the relic, I'm sorry, not relic, the road worn P bass that I showed you guys. That was a case where the pickups really were a gigantic help. And there are Lindy Fralins that I got from you guys, I believe. And that was just a great improvement in terms of the richness of the sound, the output, the evenness of the response in all registers. So it's really requires being willing to experiment and not always getting the results that you expect.
Yeah. Yeah.
And another good example of that is with bridges. And there's always a debate about high mass bridges versus lightweight bridges and how that affects sustain and resonance and all that sort of stuff. And I find that there's really no hard and fast rule. In a lot of cases, a high mass bridge will kind of choke the instrument's resonance if you have a lightweight body.
Yeah.
But that's not always true. A good example of that is my 64 Jazz here, which has a badass bridge on it. And the badass bridge is not really the most refined or evolved version of a high mass bridge out there. You know, obviously there are some newer ones that are much.
It was one of the first, right? I mean, that's
It
kind of
was the
Yeah.
first, really. There are a lot better ones out there in terms of construction and design, but for some reason, there's something about a badass that can really just work.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, they're funky in a lot of ways. So this jazz bass had some serious dead spots on the G string, particularly like the 4th to 5th fret area. And so just kind of as an experiment, I threw a badass bridge on it and it completely solved that, as well as just kind of focusing the tone overall from top to bottom. But I've done a similar thing on other Fenders or Fender clones and found that the badass just sounds terrible.
Indeed. Well, you know, it's interesting. What I've found with the high mass bridges, getting to compare tons of them, and just getting to play them and everything. Especially the later, if you take like a later duty Fender bridge, like your 64 that's now on your P bass, it seems like, at least when I'm looking at a signal, the initial attack transient in the treble response is much higher than what ends up being the bass, the mids and the bass, where the badass kind of tames an attack transient, but so everything's a bit more level,
compressed,
dynamically and tonally, and as a result, that's why it almost seems like it's sustaining better sometimes, because your ear isn't immediately just jumping onto that really super loud attack transient right out of the chute. But that doesn't always play out depending on the instrument, obviously, but that seems like that tends to be the way it kind of goes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the advice is, don't start on something that you can't, kind of, for lack of a better word, afford a mistake, right? Or undo. Yeah. And then the other is, potentially anyway, like a lot of our listeners do, they just start out on something they just pick up on Craigslist or eBay or something, and they can just kind of, it's sort of their test, playground, right? They can play around a little bit and do some stuff. And then when they're ready to graduate to something that they're playing on a regular basis, they can graduate to that. Does that sound right?
I'd say so. I'm kind of summarizing that would be maybe just to say to proceed cautiously, but you kind of touched on maybe trying to improve an entry-level instrument, where a lot of times all the hardware and electronics would be a little bit subpar. And that might be an area where you're more guaranteed to have results by just going with a better pickup or bridge or tuners.
Of course, the great part of that is, like, thankfully, that tends to be where the more affordable instruments kind of suffer. Like they'll put like a pickup shaped object in there. But luckily, the woodworking and everything else is just fine. So
exactly.
Just kind of. The other great thing too is, especially why starting with a bridge is a great place to start, especially with a Fender. I mean, there's so many bridges available now that will just directly retrofit a Fender. So if you want to try one of these bridges, like something like a Babix or something, or Babbage, depending on how it's
Yeah.
pronounced. I'm not really sure, or a, Badass, or one of their clones like the Kick-Ass or the Omega, or any of the Fender mount, hip shot A or B style stuff. I mean, you can, as long as you get a Fender mount version of it, you can always change your mind. It's like it never happened. You're not going to mar the instrument in any way.
Yeah.
And
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Maybe that's how I've built up such a huge stash of parts, by a lot of trial and error along those lines.
Yeah. Well, it's funny when you were talking earlier about back to the Tisco, like taping around the parts, to paint it. I mean, I remember being 12 and tinkering with stuff and usually ruining it and never being able to get it back. Like playing with radios and guitars and stuff too. And
Yeah.
it's intimidating to get in there and start snipping wires or unsoldering things and hoping you're going to have a prayer of putting it back where it came from correctly, so in some way kind of industrious, I think, to just kind of tape around everything.
Yeah. Well, kind of along those lines, it's been a real benefit for me to take advantage of your pre-wired harnesses with the preamps. It just saves a lot of headache, and if someone like me who doesn't have top-notch soldering skills, I mean, they've gotten a little bit better over time, but not top level. It's so much easier to have that and be able to just basically drop it in. It saved me a lot of time and headaches.
Indeed. Well, and that's the thing. It's like anything. I mean, obviously, like you spend a fair amount of time in the studio. So for someone who wasn't real familiar with that whole, just the process of recording in that way, that sort of thing, just having repetitions and doing something constantly, like speaking another language or making solder joints. It's just anything you get to do a whole bunch of times. As long as you're conscious about it, it's hopefully going to get better. That's
sure.
Yeah. But no, that's cool.
We want to talk about my Yamaha 6-string?
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a 6-string. Let's do that. Absolutely.
All right. I think Eric has a picture of it, the Yamaha TRB 6P.
I do. I'll pull it up. You can start talking about it.
This is relatively recent acquisition. I got it toward the end of last year. It's a 1992 Yamaha TRB 6P that basically has sat in its case almost its entire life.
Wow.
The original owner was a Yamaha endorsee who was basically a guitar player, but Yamaha sent him this bass for whatever reason, and it ended up just sitting around in his house until he passed away. His son had it, but in the meantime, it was stored in a storage space in Arizona, a non-climate controlled storage space. So I didn't realize it until I got it, but there was some damage as a result of the bass just sitting in its case in a basically harsh climate environment. So that's not it, actually. It's the amber colored one. It was in the second email.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think you have it.
Yeah, so the amber one you're holding has quite a flame going, like a really tight flame pattern. It's really
It does, yeah. It has more flame than most of them do.
Because usually I'm very used to seeing the quilt, like the red one. That seems way more common, but that's really great. But you could even see the tiger like in the finish a little bit, Like,
yeah, exactly. I think they just used all different kinds of maple, whatever they could get. Some of it was more curly for sure. But as far as the effects of the bass really not being maintained and stored in that kind of environment, the fingerboard wood shrank quite a bit because there was some serious fret sprout.
I can imagine there would be, yeah.
And I used a fret end file and was able to get rid of all that myself. But what happened was the frets actually poked through the finish The base has a really thick poly finish, which actually extends to the top, to the edge of the fingerboard.
Yeah.
So there's thick finish on the actual ebony on the side of the neck,
Did it just
the
crack
part of the
like,
fingerboard. Yeah.
did it crack just
So
where it poked through, or did it crack around the whole neck? I've
well,
seen
it
before.
cracked in a few places around the frets. I don't know if you can see, but
Oh yeah, you can see it.
Yeah.
You see a little air under,
toward the top there,
Yep.
there's some bubbles of finish that poke through
Well,
as the frets sprouted.
Being up here in the Northeast, I've seen that a fair amount of times. Because February is the driest month of the year up here usually. So if you have fret sprouts, that's the month you want to fix them. And
I bet, yeah.
That's usually the month when that sort of thing happens.
Yeah, and then another,
especially things like Gibsons, you see that sort of thing a lot.
I bet.
Bound fingerboards too.
Another kind of unfortunate thing is there's a fingerboard crack in the center of the fingerboard at the very end above the 24th fret.
Can you tell from looking at the end grain, does it go all the way through the fingerboard, or is it just more of a surface thing?
I think it's surface, yeah. And eventually, I think if I get any fret work done, I'll have someone fill it in. I guess the solution would be just using ebony dust, that matches the color of the fingerboard, and gluing it in there with super glue.
Correct, yeah.
So it's not a huge thing as far as affecting the playability or anything, but it's kind of unfortunate that there's a long fingerboard crack. And another really odd thing is the poly finish on the body actually shrunk to the point that you can feel the grain.
That's what I was thinking. I could actually see it looked like it had a texture. Like
you can see it.
Illusion, yeah.
And that's very odd, something I have never seen before. Obviously, it doesn't affect the playability of the instrument, but it's kind of a strange thing to see. So I guess the lesson in all of that is it is important to maintain instruments, even if they're just being stored for a long period of time. I'm sure that oiling the fingerboard periodically, having it in maybe a humidified case or something that helped, a humidifier in the case, I should say.
Indeed.
Something that kept the humidity more constant would have prevented some of those things from happening. But apart from that, I mean, I don't know if you guys have played one of these, but they're kind of interesting. They have sort of the early 90s style of thick poly finish, gold hardware, through body design, all those things that made it kind of an expensive instrument for Yamaha to produce. So they didn't do it this way for very long until they went to bolt-on neck, and some things that I'm sure were much more cost-effective for them to make. But
it's got a pretty full string spacing too, right? It's kind of like a 4-string.
Yeah.
2 extra strings on it. I mean, it's a full.
It's 2 1/4 inch, 2 1/4 at the nut, 19 millimeter spacing at the bridge, and that actually suits me because I like wide spacing. Kind of the wider the better for me, but it also was kind of unusual at the time to have that wide of a neck. A lot of the earlier multi-string basses have very narrow necks, and that, I don't know what the origin of that is. Maybe people that designed them just had small hands and it felt comfortable for them, but not to play.
I think some of it might blend a certain amount to economy too. Like I'm thinking like something like carving before their Kiesel, but actually after their Kiesel, then they were carving out their Kiesel again. But that's really but so like like the LB70 would have 19 millimeter spacing, and then you get to the 5-string, and then the neck wouldn't be that much larger, and then you'd be at like 17 millimeter spacing, and then you'd be all the way down to 16 and a half spacing by the time you got to a 6-string, and they're using the same pickup shape for all 4, 5, and 6 strings.
Right, and so the outer strings probably barely cleared the magnets on the pickups.
Right, and like some companies like Ibanez or some of the Lakeland Skyline stuff, where they'll use the licensed MK1 pickup shape, when they'll use it for 4, 5, and 6 string, because it's just blades internally. So whatever, as long as it fits within the sensing area,
Right.
it's happening. But then obviously like Music Man Stingray 5 string, kind of the 17.5 millimeter spacing versus 19. I think some of it's just a matter of just not having to have a neck blank that is so ginormous.
Yeah.
Maybe
not all that additional tooling to mill next to different sizes. Yeah.
But potentially, I'm only speculating. But
yeah, well, it sounds logical. Sounds like you're right. And this instrument also has piezo pickup elements in the bridge, which was kind of a unique and strange idea. But you can blend that piezo in with the magnetic pickups, and there's a cut switch, a low frequency cut switch, which I think acts at about 60.
Yeah, it gets rid of that boomy kind of.
Yeah. So I've actually found that to be kind of cool, to be able to dial in some of the piezo signal. It's a nice kind of woody acoustic sound that, if you get it blended a certain way with the magnetic pickups, it's kind of an interesting flavor.
Well, imagine especially too if you're doing a lot of if you're playing a lot of more like chordal kind of things, it probably would help it help there to be a little bit more articulation, and just with it responding differently too.
Yeah.
Your strings are those like super steps or like contact core super steels?
They are contact core super steels. Yeah.
I can guess strings.
Yeah, that's great. Excellent. You've seen enough of them.
Yeah, I those are awesome strings. Those are great. Those are great strings.
They are. Yeah, I've been a GHS endorsee for a long time, and they've been my main strings for ages.
Yeah, nice piano, full spectrum kind of tone with those, and they feel great too.
Yeah, truly.
Yeah, very nice. I wanted to ask you, when you had like the last bass out too, like any like things that you've recorded on it that really stick out to you, is like something that was like really great that you're really proud of, that you played with that particular instrument.
On the Warmoth P bass?
Yeah, or just even if there's like a kind of like cool like story like attached to it. I mean, either bass and all of them, honestly,
Yeah, well, I wish there was a cool story attached to it, but I have used it on a lot of records. I mean, none of which are really huge hits, but you can definitely hear it out there. There's a record that I actually produced and played all the bass on that's just coming out this week, I think, or next week. The artist is Sean Della Croce. She's a singer-songwriter from Nashville, and this record is being released on a Concord subsidiary label, and it'll be on all the streaming platforms. Sean Della Croce, DellaCroce. The record's called Illuminations, and on almost every track that I played electric bass, I use the Warmoth P. The other half of the tracks are upright bass, but there is one song called Monument on that album that has a lot of melodic stuff on the bass, where you can really kind of hear the character of that bass up in the high register. So if anybody is inclined enough to check it out, that's a good example of it.
I'll definitely check it out. That's great.
So in terms of the way that I mean, it just sounds like your music has evolved over the years. What about the actual instruments you're playing, or what, sort of what does the next 10 years look like? I mean, is that like, if like I'm going to continue to move along the same sort of path I've been on, or is there any kind of experimentation you're doing? Like, what's the next 10 years look like, assuming that we can get out into the world again?
Yeah. Well, I hope to be able to get in front of audiences with some of the various bands that I'm playing in. If things improve, with the pandemic, hoping that they will, like everybody else. But apart from that, really for about the last 20 years, I've been moving more into the recording and producing side of things. And that started in the early 2000s where I did a lot of scoring for action sports film and video projects,
Okay.
things like the Fuel TV network. And my brother-in-law is a pretty well-known professional skateboarder, Tony Hawk.
No way.
So
Really? That's
yeah,
cool.
so he was able to kind of pull me in on some of his video projects, and that was my entree into that world.
Cool.
And that kind of culminated with
That's awesome.
being the musical director for his Boom Boom Huck Jam tour that happened in the mid 2000s. That was an arena tour that included skating, BMX, motocross, and music.
Right.
For the first 2 years, it was live bands, and then it kind of progressed more into pre-records, which I did as well. But that was kind of a once in a lifetime experience. But to answer your question, I think I see things for me going more into the world of producing and recording music.
Yeah.
And for the most part, in the last few years already, it's been kind of 50-50 in that respect. This year, once we were locked down, recording was pretty much all anybody was doing for a while musically. So I had quite a flurry of projects ranging from just doing bass tracks for other people to full-on production for a couple of album projects for outside clients here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And there's more of that going on. And the hope for me also is to get out a solo project, which always seems to be on the back burner because things that pay the bills seem to take precedence over that. But I've already accumulated kind of nearly an album's worth of material, some of which originated in scoring projects and kind of repurposed it for an actual album. That's what I see. I mean, 10 years is a long way out to make a prediction, but I kind of favor having a balance of different things. I'm not ever really content just doing one thing.
Yeah.
So the balance between playing live and recording is always good for me to have, and I hope that continues as long as I'm physically able to to carry gear.
Yeah, I mean, one thing inspires the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing inspires the other. I think that's
and they're
right.
so different. I mean, I love them both for completely different reasons. It's just live is just a different animal than being in the studio or writing, and the whole process is just so different. But
it is, and they do kind of both feed each other, as Eric said.
Yeah, agreed.
Cool. So I guess I don't know, Frankie, last question. You want to wrap it up? I've got a question, and I know, well, I'll give Frankie a minute. Here's my question. So I love to sort of ask this because there are so many people that we talk to when we do these podcasts, and I learn so much. One of the things that I realize is that people sort of have these, networks of concentric circles of like-minded people that they like to work with and play with and collaborate with. So if we could just interview anybody in your immediate circle, somebody that inspires you, somebody that you play with, or it could be anybody really. Who would that be? Who would you recommend?
Well, I think there are some bass players that I know that you probably would really enjoy talking to. One guy that comes to mind, who you probably haven't heard of, is named Stuart Liebig. And he lives in Los Angeles. I've known him for decades. but he's always been an inspiration to me because he takes the bass into some directions that are really unique and unexpected and kind of not characteristic of the bass vocabulary so much.
Yeah.
But I think you guys would really enjoy talking to him because he's kind of just carved out his own world of bass sounds and kind of adapted gear to meet his needs along those lines.
That's awesome.
So yeah, he's one person for sure. I think it's always interesting to talk to people that have long history of a long career, a long history in music. And I can think of a few people like that. Bob Glaub being one guy who
Sure. Oh yeah.
you certainly would enjoy talking to. I mean, he's just a super guy, very personable, and has played with everybody for ages. So
that's not an
he's another guy.
exaggeration.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah, and I'm sure as soon as we sign off, I'll think of others, so I could give you that later. But
I tell you what we could do is we could put them in the show notes for anybody that's listening. You know, we could just put it right in the show notes for the podcast so that.
Oh, sure.
Because I know there's some credits and, you know, folks that we want to acknowledge. Definitely, we'll just include that. We'll include some of the pictures of the bases, if you'll let us do that, and it'll be just good for somebody who's, you know, wanting to take a look at some of the things that we've been talking about. Just put them right in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah, I can share that with you for sure.
Awesome.
Really cool. I guess to maybe wrap it up, but I was sort of thinking of asking this before, but then when you mentioned you've been waiting for so long to actually get around to doing your own solo record, it kind of answered the question. Whereas I was going to ask if you could do any project with anyone for every, you know, what would it be? And I suspect, you know, I guess if we take your solo record maybe out of the equation, because obviously that has to be like you know, if you just constantly putting on the back burner just out of pure sacrifice, you know, at this point, necessity, you know, what would that be? But I guess I was also thinking if you were going to do, you know, especially given how long you've been, you know, doing this and the different parts of this industry you've had some success with at this point, you know, between the playing live and the production and engineering and recording as a side person and that sort of thing, you know, if you weren't doing this, what else do you think you could possibly do that would give you the same type of at least satisfaction that you could say, you know, I'm, you know, life is, you know, I like what I do, you know, if it wasn't this, I guess.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. And it's hard for me to answer because I've been focused on music fairly continuously since I was about 7 or 8 years old. So to think of doing anything else is really foreign. But I like
jerk at your brain a little bit. You know, you're like, oh no.
Yeah. Well, on the other hand, though, just being only completely immersed in music and nothing else is not healthy. You know, you have to have a well-rounded experience of the world around you, and it can make for a very boring musician to really just be focused on music 24/7 and not have any other input. But I think photography would be one thing that I would delve into if I wasn't doing music, because I've always had an interest in it and have even done a self-published book of photography of my travels about 10 years ago. So that is probably my answer.
It's a good one. I mean,
yeah,
something
but
I mean, it's another
photography is. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Photography is an area that's kind of analogous to music in that with smartphones, everybody is a genius photographer, and you don't need years of art school training to come up with amazing images. So that's good and bad, obviously, just like in music. When you have the ability to cut and paste and use samples and create music without a lot of serious training.
Right.
You know, it cuts both ways. I mean, there's some amazing music that's been made that way. Just like how you go on Instagram and see
Yep.
some of the most amazing photos ever,
Yep.
with people just pulling out their iPhones.
Yep.
But another thing I should say is, maybe one reason why I haven't delved into solo projects sooner is I kind of enjoy being in the background or being part of an ensemble, maybe more than being the center of attention. And that may be something that you find with bass players, not universally, but maybe more than some other instruments, because it's possible to have a lot of influence over the music, really steer the music without an obvious appearance of kind of being in the middle of things.
So,
And
subversive.
yeah, subversive is a good word. And I think I'm really a chameleon musically, because I like a lot of different kinds of music and like to just try to play different styles as authentically as I can, to varying degrees of success. But that can that chameleon quality can make it sort of hard to hone in on one thing that defines you musically.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
So it's hard for people to relate to a specific project or album that is too diverse for their comprehension. So I would kind of have to hone it into something fairly narrow, which I think I've done to some degree. But you kind of pay the price of being versatile sometimes in making it harder to find your own identity.
So what kind of advice would you give to somebody that actually does that? Because now I'm fascinated. We can't finish yet. So
Okay. Yeah.
what kind of advice would you give to somebody who is, really just kind of getting going and trying to find their sound? Like, how do you explore that? I've seen musicians that, they love the process, of getting there. And then there are some that I talk to, and they're like, I wish I knew then what I knew now, right? Because I could have had so much more like enjoyment, during that time. I'm just kind of curious, what kind of advice would you give somebody that's looking for that?
Well, first of all, just keep your ears open. Don't be prejudiced about a specific style of music. At least be open to checking something out and seeing what you can learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
And on the playing side, just get in as many diverse situations as possible, playing with different people of all levels. It obviously it helps to be motivated and inspired by playing with people that are better than you, but sometimes you can learn things from people that are approaching music from even a much more innocent level. So don't avoid any potential situations to make music with people. Be curious, be open, and also try to keep learning constantly. You can never stop getting better and gaining more skills and more knowledge and exposure to different kinds of music.
I love that.
Sure.
I love that.
That's probably a great place to stop. I can't top that.
Yeah.
I don't think I can either.
That's good. Well, so this has been amazing. It really has. I've enjoyed it. I know, I could probably speak for Frankie and the rest of the guys. This has been one of those things where we love sitting down and sort of pulling stories out of people and then being able to share those with the audience has been something that Frankie and I've been talking about doing for a long time, and and then be able to also like get to meet face to face with some of our the customers, and just allowing us to make sort of make that face to face connection has been a lot of fun too. So hopefully this has been fun for you too, and we're definitely going to keep doing this as we keep going.
Yeah, I'm honored you guys included me, and it's great to meet you and talk to you, and I hope we'll do it again sometime.
You too, Alan.
Absolutely. This is great. All right. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Okay,
right.
Eric.
Take care.
Excellent.
Bye, Frankie.
Pleasure, Ben.
Bye.